MultiGreen, building attainable, sustainable, and tech-enabled multifamily real estate through impact investing.
Welcome to the MultiGreen podcast. This episode is part of a series captured live in Washington, D.C. at the Terwilliger Center Summit on Housing Supply Solutions, hosted by the Bipartisan Policy Center. I'm your host, Randy Norton, and today we'll be speaking with Len Wolfson, partner at Fed Hall. We discuss the origins and scope of the current housing crisis and review recent efforts to address and resolve it. Enjoy our conversation. Len Wolfson, partner of Fed Hall, with us here today on the podcast. Thank you for being with us.
It's great to be here, Randy.
Tell us what you do at Fed Hall.
Good. So I'm one of the partners at Fed Hall, which is a boutique government affairs firm. We focus almost exclusively on the financial services industry. My focus, given my background, is primarily on housing. We have a lot of great clients in the housing finance, real estate sphere, including the Bipartisan Policy Center, who we are here with today.
What is your message and what are you trying to get out of this here today?
Well, I'm thrilled with what BPC is doing here because they are focusing the attention squarely on where it ought to be, which is that our nation has a massive housing supply problems, probably somewhere in the vicinity of 5 million units. It's been something that really arose out of the Great Recession back in 2008, the financial crisis. We stopped building. We never really ramped up again, and the pandemic just exacerbated a lot of those issues. So we've got a chronic undersupply of housing in this country. I don't think that policymakers in Washington are really focusing on that, and I'm glad that BPC is shining a light on this.
It's hard to define how the housing shortage really is quantified. Moody's suggests that we're short somewhere, in the 1.4 million unit range. Harvard would suggest we're in the 4.8 million unit range. The National Association of Realtors would suggest that we're in the 6.8 million unit range on the shortfall. But also there's this housing stock that is uninhabitable, which nobody is measuring. So some could say, hey, we need 10 million units to really bring the housing standard and condition forward. How do we measure this?
It is hard to measure. It's why the numbers you cited, it's why I picked one in the middle of it, because I've seen some of the lower figures, I've seen some of the higher figures, but most of the economists or most of the research I've seen here tends to pinpoint it in the 4 or 5 million range, and I think that's probably accurate. But yes, there are a lot of existing units that need to be preserved, and when you start counting those, you get to the higher number.
I agree with that analysis. So what is the Bipartisan Policy Center and the J. Ronald Terwilliger Institute promoting and suggesting is some of the supply solutions today?
Some of the things that we've been talking about at the Terwilliger Center center around, we've got to build. It's a supply problem, so there's only one way out of it, and that's building more housing. And at all levels, really, but especially some of those starter homes, more rental units. There's such a focus on home ownership in this country, but we're really lagging behind in rental units. What Ron and others at the center have been talking about is, how do we incentivize building, whether it's through regulatory relief or tax credits, like the low-income housing tax credit. There's a number of things that policymakers can do at the federal level. A lot of it is state and local, of course, to make it easier to build more housing.
Is there any recent wins from a policy perspective or the work that you've been doing here in DC that you can talk about?
I think housing has been overlooked for many years. The last big housing bill was the Housing and Economic Recovery Act of 2008. So that was right around the time of the financial crisis. Since then, a lot of the attention has been on how do we get Fannie and Freddie out of conservatorship. I think there's been that's an incredibly important question, but I think there's been too much emphasis on that issue, and as a result, we haven't focused on a lot of the other housing challenges that we've got in this country, chief among them the supply issue.
I'm a practitioner on the ground. I know that this is a state, county, and municipality, at a city level issue. The feds have done many wonderful things, macroeconomically speaking. There's a lot of policies and incentives in place for us. We can't use all of them. But how do we get this trickle-down economics to benefit or to incentivize the cities and the counties to help us expedite, this reform of building more supply? It seems like that is the delay for me on the ground.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head, and you may not like my answer here, but I think the federal government is limited in its levers here. That's the federalist system that we have here. This is primarily a state and local issue, and so if you're having trouble building in California, you've got to look at the California state and local. Whether it's zoning and land use, the environmental regulations, there's a lot of things that add to the cost and delay your ability to build. There's not a lot that the federal government can do here, and I think that has stymied policymakers to a large degree.
Yesterday, Harvard's Joint Center for Housing Studies came out with their annual report, and it said that they were supporting the recent Build Back Better initiative, among other policies, to help us in this space. That seems like a policy here that may benefit us here on the ground as a housing producer. What are your thoughts?
I think it's only going to make things worse, and I'll tell you why. Most of the Build Back Better has about $150 billion in housing funding. Most of it is demand side driven. It is not meant to deal with supply. It is things like down payment assistance, rental assistance. All of these are subsidies that are going to put upward pressure on housing prices, on the cost of rent, really make a lot of the challenges that we have worse. So I was actually relieved to see the Biden administration about a month ago put out its housing supply plan. I see it as the White House acknowledging that they need to take a different approach. You'll recall the White House about a year ago put forward a number of housing supply proposals, and then they sort of forgot about those, and all the emphasis shifted to Build Back Better, which was just a very different set of demand side proposals. I feel like policymakers, both in the White House and what we're doing here at BPC today, are pivoting back to where the discussion really needs to be, and that's on increasing supply, not on juicing demand. I mean, we have a red hot housing market. Why do we want to juice demand even more?
You are here in DC representing the largest segment of our GDP, which is finance and the real estate industry. 20 to 22% annually of our economy is focused in this market segment. Is this just too big of a challenge to address?
It's not too big of an issue, but it's not something that we can resolve at just one level of government, be it federal, state, or local. And frankly, it can't all be government. The private sector has to play a critical role here. After all, we're talking about building more homes. So we need builders, we need developers, we need the financing for it. We ask, what can the federal government do here? And I'm wondering what can be done to make it easier for developers to build.
Len Wolfson, Fed Hall partner, thank you so much for being with us today on the podcast.
My pleasure, Andy. Thank you.
Thank you for listening. Join us as we build 40,000 attainable, sustainable, and tech-enabled multifamily homes by 2030. And if you like the content you're hearing, hit the subscribe button. Follow us at Think MultiGreen and sign up to learn more at www.multi.green.